It's actually pretty interesting how mechanical it can be to produce an idea. It takes a lot psychologically to start doing it, but the terror of the blank page is not so bad when the blank page is a piece of celluloid that has material properties that you know about.
From the heart of The Ohio State University on the Oval, this is Voices of Excellence from the College of Arts and Sciences, with your host, David Staley. Voices focuses on the innovative work of arts and sciences faculty and staff. With departments as wide-ranging as art, astronomy, chemistry and biochemistry, physics, emergent materials, and mathematics and languages, among many others, the college always has something exciting happening. Join us to find out what's new now.
Joining me today in the ASC Marketing and Communications studio is Roger Beebe, Professor of Art and Theater, Film, and Media Arts, where he serves as core faculty in the Moving Image Production major. He is a filmmaker whose work consists primarily of multi-projector performances and essayistic videos that explore the world of found images and the found landscapes of late capitalism. His work has been screened at the Sundance Film Festival and the Museum of Modern Art, but he's also shown his films around in such unlikely venues as the CBS Jumbotron in Times Square and McMurdo Station in the Antarctic, and I'm going to have to ask him about that. Dr. Beebe, welcome to Voices.
Thanks for having me.
Well, and I do want to talk about your films, but I want to begin, first of all, with I think the way that you define your work, which I find really interesting. You're an experimental filmmaker, but you also use this word expanded cinema. So maybe give us a sense of what that might mean.
Yeah, I mean, expanded cinema is a relatively old term. My colleague at Denison, Jonathan Wally, has a book on expanded cinema. He has the book on expanded cinema. It goes back to the 60s, people like Stan Vanderbeek, and it was all about turning a screening into an event, a sense of liveness, a sense of ephemerality, something other than just sitting in a dark room and letting the thing happen. You know, you don't just turn the projector on and sit there for 2 hours. You produce the thing in various ways. And I mean, the book is great in detailing all of the kind of expansive ways people have understood expanded cinema. My own version of it is mostly a 16 millimeter practice. So I have old 16 millimeter classroom projectors. These Bell and Howell, you know, I got them for $10 a piece when the school board was selling them off in Florida. I have 8 or 9 of them now, and I usually deploy about 5 or 6 of them for these shows.
At a time.
Yeah, and so I'll deploy them in various configurations, use the rectangle of the frame almost like a choreographer would use dancers, so you don't have to fill the rectangle. It's about how they react to each other. Sometimes they overlap, sometimes they're on opposite corners of the screen, sometimes they're just adjacent to each other. Sometimes I get up to all 6 projectors being on, and then I turn them all off except for one suddenly, and it's a strange practice that has evolved over the years. It definitely only happened because I was starting to hoard all those projectors, and I realized there was a possibility of doing more than just doing a projection and standing there until the show was over and I could actually do something again, have a Q&A.
So is expanded cinema like a happening?
Yeah, I mean, that's definitely part of it. I mean, happening is sort of more of an art world term, but for sure it's part of the same spirit of that era. I think it grew out of the same thing. It happens in relationship to cinema rather than to art, right?
So I like the way you describe this, that you're like a choreographer, except you're using 16 millimeter film projectors. Say a little more about that. How are you like a choreographer?
Yeah, I mean, I also use the metaphor of the orchestra conductor, and maybe that's more
interesting
apt too,
metaphors.
Yeah, well, you know, I point at this projector and it turns on, and I point at that one and it turns on. I call in, 2 paired projectors. I take out 4 projectors. Yeah, so there is a kind of, I guess, I don't know if I want to say a dance. I think my dance friends would not like me to say that, but probably my music friends wouldn't like me saying I'm a conductor either. But it does feel like orchestral in the sense that there's an ensemble that I'm sort of leading, especially because I use found elements. I don't feel like the sole artist in the room. I do feel like I'm collaborating with these found educational industrial films, but then I also make, cameraless things. I also do shoot. So yeah, the film is a kind of weird orchestra, and I do sort of sit there behind the projectors, running back and forth, sweating, sometimes swearing when things go badly. Yeah, I conduct that little orchestra. But I mean, the dance metaphor I think of more in relationship to the screen space. I did make a dance film back in 2000, and, it was really nice because I made it in collaboration. The choreographer did all of the work of making the dance, and I really just got to think about the stage space and how we translate that to a film, how you translate that to the frame. And so I think it's the same thing. It's where do you put the bodies on the space you're provided? You've got this sort of proscenium. I mean, it's upright rather than flat. But yeah, sometimes you only want one thing in the corner, and sometimes you want the entire thing filled with, interacting, movement, right?
Well, let's talk about some of your work. And I wonder if you'll be able to put into words this experience. But let's start with your 2022 film, Beebe's Quickie Karaoke Factory, which is a very evocative title, I have to say.
Yeah, so that is actually an ongoing project. So the origin was during the pandemic, and for whatever reason, the most perverse desire came to me that I wanted to make karaoke videos for a time where we could not have karaoke. So videos that kind of had no chance of being screened in the way they were intended, at least until we emerged from the pandemic. The origin story is that the PDX Film Festival in Portland, Oregon in 2008, they solicited a bunch of experimental filmmakers to make karaoke videos for a late night party at the festival. And it was great. It was incredible. It sort of aligns with this expanded cinema practice. Something different than just playing a video happened. We did a sing-along, a bunch of experimental film hipsters in Portland, Oregon, did a sing-along to Somewhere Out There, and it was magical, brought tears to my eyes, And I made one then for Mudhoney's song, Touch Me, I'm Sick, and I used a sex ed film, a fairly graphic sex ed film, so literalized the metaphor of the song lyrics. And that was one of the moves that I figured out, was taking a song lyric and then literalizing the metaphor. So I made one for Hall & Oates' One-on-One, and it's the one-on-one video game with Michael Jordan and Larry Bird. And so it's just them rubbing against each other in a kind of semi-romantic way, slowed down. But I came up with some other moves, too. I'm sort of interested in this, and it's actually an assignment I've done with students, too, thinking in meta ways about the form of a karaoke video or a music video, thinking about what you can do that's weird. So I made one for Kenny G's Songbird, which is entirely instrumental. And so you literally just stand there as the thermometer counts down for 4 minutes. I made one for Steve Reich's clapping music, which no one has dared to perform yet. But it is, a complicated phase shift clapping duet. I really love the idea of it. I can't wait for someone to actually try it. I did put training wheels on that, so you actually hear 4 bars of the performers doing it, and then you have to do 4 bars on your own. So in theory, there should be helpful guidelines for anyone who does attempt it. I made one for Gertrude Stein's If I Told Him, a completed portrait of Picasso. And actually someone in Memphis on Valentine's Day did a very memorable performance of that. He was an English PhD. He had taught the poem, and it's a tongue twister, and he was able to keep up with it. So yeah, it's a very weird thing, and I kind of want to keep making new moves, figuring out new ways of using that form weirdly. But they are really made for karaoke performance. I did a show in Oakland at Shapeshifters as part of this last tour that I did. I was meant to do one in Chapel Hill at a festival called Cosmic Rays, but I was sick, and so they did it in my absence, and I just saw the photos afterwards. So I sort of am the karaoke jock at these. Anyway, it's a super weird thing. It's very specific. Lots of experimental film, sort of high-low culture jokes. But it's a fun thing, and I figure I'll continue to add to the body of maybe 15 videos that I've made now.
So it's like growing or secreting. Is that the image?
I just made one for Duran Duran's Wild Boys that uses Joseph Boys in a cage with a coyote, and so again another sort of simple punning joke.
Well, it seems that this is built of associations and juxtapositions. Is that a fair statement?
Yeah, for sure. And sometimes I feel a little self-conscious that they're too obvious. I do feel like the Joseph Boys one, there's just one joke.
He's a German artist.
Sure. Yeah. And so I think the more successful ones are the ones where the joke keeps on giving, or you find more in the footage. So the first one I made, the Touch Me, I'm Sick video, there's an instrumental part, and there's a kind of wonderful animation in the sex ed film about various parts of the body getting inflamed as a result of their syphilis or whatever. And so as the guitar solo, rages, you see, first this part, radiating pain, and then this part. And so I do feel like when there's a little bit more, to reward you for staying with it rather than the reveal of the joke is But they're, as the title of the kind of project says, they're quick. I don't belabor these, or I can crank out 2 in an afternoon if I'm really inspired or if they're really straightforward.
So you've told us some places where you've shown this. Describe for us the site or the setting. What's the space in which these are being displayed?
Yeah, I mean, it can be anything. So I was on tour for 9 weeks this semester, and I did about 40 shows. They are in any space that'll have me. I travel in my Prius with all my projectors, with a PA, with stands, with cables. So I can turn any empty room that can be darkened into a micro cinema. And so it can be like that. It can be an existing microcinema like Shapeshifters in Oakland. I played at a lot of experimental music spaces, actually. And so, in Santa Cruz and Flagstaff, those were experimental music venues primarily. I played at a kind of punk bookstore, coffee shop, bar in Orlando. I played at a proper movie theater in Tampa the day before that. I played at a kind of fancy, a thing called Deering Estate in Miami that's sort of a fancy nature preserve on an old historic home. So really, wherever my local host, has a space for it.
Is the space itself sort of an element in the film, or is it just the vessel for the film?
It ends up being, the performance has to take the shape of the container, and so if it's a very short throw and a small screen, the films end up being a little different. Sometimes the spaces are taller, sometimes they're wider. So I have to figure out every night. It's part of the puzzle. I take 2 hours ahead of each show to set everything up and figure out how it's all going to fit in. I come up with a program after seeing the room, so I know there are some rooms where I can't do some films just because I can't squeeze enough gear in, or because the throw is not big enough, or the image is too big given how far the throw is. So it's crazy. It's a crazy thing to do. It's 9 weeks of tour with 13,000 miles on the old 2007 Prius. I don't know. I wonder how many more of these I have in me.
You had said that in the sort of the early days of the pandemic, you had the idea to make karaoke videos. What was the genesis of the idea of this performance?
Yeah, again, it goes back to that 2008 thing, but I hadn't made one since 2008. And I don't know, I think I was actually in a little down period of creative production, and it was a way to get the gears turning. It was a nice way, kind of a low stakes way to do some stuff, to sit in front of the computer, do some editing, not have to kind of generate a big thing. Because again, these expanded cinema works don't exist unless I'm on tour, showing them. There's documentation of them, but it's just really not, it's no substitute for the actual thing. And so I did think it was really hard to imagine when I didn't know when I could tour again. I did some touring during the Omicron wave. I was performing wearing a mask. A whole leg of shows got canceled, and yeah, it was a giant bummer, and it was a real challenge to the kind of, cinematic practice that I've developed. During that time, though, I will say I was productive. I took over the management of a community garden. It's been really important to my thinking about my work now. I know we might talk about that later. So yeah, I was doing other stuff. I was reading plenty, but it was kind of hard to imagine ever making work for a performance context that I didn't know when it would return. And somehow these karaoke videos, again, they were low stakes. They were easy ways to get the kind of gears turning again.
Well, and you're addressing this, I think, but I'm very curious to know about, I guess, your process. Where do ideas come from? How do they germinate? Or do they just sort of happen and you don't really give much thought to it?
No, in your introduction, you pointed to the two kind of poles of my production, and I think the two different ways of making have really different origin stories. The essayistic works like Amazonia, it came out of an idea that might well have been an essay, and in fact, eventually did turn into a kind of companion essay. The idea was what happens on the other end of our mouse clicks. I had this idea in 2005. I was thinking about the magic of ordering online and, what's really behind that magic and whose body is on the other end of our mouse click. What does that look like? What does that feel like? How are those cities being transformed? How is the world being transformed? And so I started traveling to those towns and just shooting footage. So that had a really kind of grounded, essayistic core, right? It had an idea at the center. Same thing with the Comic Sans video, where I made this video about Comic Sans. It's a reviled font, but it was used for the I Can't Breathe shirts after Eric Garner's murder. And
That's right. Yeah.
And there was a lot of snarky commentary online about it. And I started to really kind of think about, why that font was used and get beyond my own sort of snarky response to the use of that font. And so think about race, class, and gender in relationship to the aesthetic. And yeah, so again, that video kind of it was really clear it was an idea that drove that. And so it drove me into that essayistic mode, which tends to have a lot more talking, has a lot more, often happens in video. Recently it's been happening in a kind of desktop cinema space, so a recording of the screen space where you can kind of, comment on how knowledge is processed through that space now. But it's also a multi-window environment that's very much like my expanded cinema stuff. But then on the other end of the spectrum, there are films that are really materially driven, films where it's an investigation of what happens when you do this to this medium. And so these 16 millimeter films, sometimes they are very much like that. Or it can be really driven by the archive, can be really driven by me watching an old educational film and thinking, wow, what is this image I just found? And what can I kind of connect it to? What can I build around this? And then sometimes I do go target it into the archive to look for things on a specific theme. So I was asked to make a film for a planetarium back in 2008. And so I got all of the space films, all of the astronomy films, anything with comet or asteroid or planet, and use those alongside some cameraless abstractions to make that piece. So again, it's actually pretty interesting how mechanical it can be to produce an idea. It takes a lot, I think, psychologically to kind of just start doing it. But, I think in some ways it's not, the terror of the blank page is not so bad when the blank page is a piece of celluloid that has material properties that you know about. And so you just start, I have an idea right now that I want to put developer in a spray bottle. And so shoot film, but then spray the developer onto the film, and so have the image.
The chemical developer.
Yeah, right, exactly. And so the image will be produced in this sort of weird modeled way. And I don't even know if this is I don't know if this will turn into a film, but it's an idea for how to start making a thing without having to have the idea figured out.
Well, it sounds like you're really open to ideas, and maybe that's a distinction we could draw.
Yeah, it's an interesting. It is the most interesting question. I remember having a student at Duke when I was still in grad school, asking me where ideas come from, and I was stunned. I just didn't even understand that could be a question, because I did seem to have a whole inventory of ideas for future films. But now I've realized that it is absolutely the best question, the most important question, and somehow unanswerable. And I do think different artists work in different ways. But for me, when I do return to some sort of material investigation, some kind of formal investigation like that, that's a place I know I can always sort of be happy starting from. And sometimes they have really long gestation periods. So my film Lineage for Norman McLaren, I don't know how many years I was making these loops before I finally had a residency where I thought, okay, I got to just take this in there and figure out if there's a film in here. Same thing happened with Historia Calamitatum, this video I made about men crying. I'd been gathering fragments since 1999. I finally made it in 2014. And so, yeah, sometimes it is just contextual, where it's just you get thrown into this cabin in the woods, at McDowell, and you're like, you got 2 weeks, you got to come out of here with something, and you've got this pile of stuff. So, but I think one of the things that is important for me in making is to let the images lead. I think the thing that slowed me down with the Amazon film was the idea was so clear from the start. For me, it's when I'm working with archival images or something, it's really great to see what's in front of you and see where that leads you, rather than sort of saying, I have this idea, I need to shoehorn in a picture of this here. And that helps, I think, to take some of the pressure off of you to have it all figured out. The figuring out is like putting a puzzle together.
I'd introduced you as someone who had shown your film on the CBS Jumbotron in Times Square, and I just have to ask you about this. You have to tell us about this event.
Yeah, it's thrilling to have done it, but it was just a program where at midnight, I think it was, for 1 minute, they gave the Jumbotron to artist projects. And so the curator of the series had seen my film strip mall trilogy from 2001 and just asked if she could show the first part of it. It has some voiceover, so I had to turn that into text. But I actually never saw it screened there. I actually sent a friend to document it, and she was so overwhelmed by all of the screens, she couldn't figure out which one was the one that was showing my film. So sadly, it really did exist. Regularly Times Square does give over their screens to artists. My former student of mine, Jody Mack, had her work on every screen in Times Square for a project they were doing. Wow. And again, it was for 3 minutes or something. But so yeah, it was thrilling I wish I had, I could probably track back all of the email correspondence around how that happened. But it was really someone reaching out of the blue. That film, played around a lot, and kind of wonderful to see this little tiny Super 8 film, blown up on a giant Jumbotron. Because so Super 8, right, the smallest kind of home movie format that, many of our distant family memories are stored on. So I shot that film on Super 8. And so to think of something that small being blown up, I assume that was part of what drove the curator's interest, is the small gauge and the largest format. So.
Well, how about the work at the McMurdo station in the Antarctic?
Yeah, so the Polies, the Arctic researchers.
Is that what they're called, the Polies?
Yeah, my dad actually applied to be one back in the day, way back when. But yeah, they're snowed in for 3/4 of the year. And so when they need something to entertain them. So there's a guy, Joel Bashar, in San Francisco, who is a curator, who they reached out to. They actually made an experimental film that he had screened. And so they had a relationship, and they were like, would you put together some programs for us for this next long winter? And so, yeah, film was included in one of those programs. I didn't get to travel down there for that.
That was my next question.
Yeah. No, it's a great regret. I wish my travel funding at the University of Florida was enough to get down there. But no, I think the whole point was that you couldn't go in the time where they're screening those works.
I'm curious to know how you became a filmmaker. Were you making films as a kid?
Yeah, no, nothing like that. I came to it really late, and I feel fortunate that I did, because I don't have a bunch of juvenilia that I have to be embarrassed about. So I didn't start making films until I was in grad school. Yeah, at Amherst College, where I went for undergrad, I took a couple film classes, but there really wasn't a film curriculum. I had a friend or two who made films as independent studies, but it just wasn't a possibility there, at least formally. And then I had a fellowship in Paris, and I was supposed to be writing a thesis on the clown in French literature. Somehow I ended up working as a projectionist all year and was going to the movies 3 times a day. And so I think that's when it was really starting to form the foundation of me making films. So when I got back, very much under the influence of Jean-Luc Godard, I made my first films. They aren't great. It took me a little while to figure out what I was doing. I had seen very little experimental cinema at that point, but I was in a PhD program for something entirely different. I was at the PhD program in literature at Duke. I was studying, film and media studies, but
writing about film rather than making films?
Yeah, but I did have the freedom there to start making films, and there was a student collective that had a bunch of money and a bunch of gear, and so as I got more and more into it, I was able to make stuff on the side. Suddenly the side became the center. And so, yeah, my first job at the University of Florida was a half production, half history theory. And, after 13 years there, I was able to convince Ohio State that I am a filmmaker/artist. And so I teach studio classes full time now.
Who are your influences? You mentioned Godard, but who are your influences?
Yeah, Godard is no longer doesn't have his fingerprints on my current practice in the same kind of way. Who would I say? There's a whole history of experimental animation that I find really influential. Norman McLaren, I mentioned already. Lineage for Norman McLaren is directly dedicated to him and has images from 2 documentaries about him. Len Lai, Harry Smith, these are all people from the 30s, 40s who were making cameraless films, these kind of crazy, wonderful experiments.
Cameraless film? You have to
so films that work directly on the material so that you're making colors and shapes, and it's sort of, consonant with what's happening in a Mondrian painting or something, that it's just happening in time. So, Hans Richter and a lot of the kind of European artists were thinking about it explicitly in those terms, about making cinema and art alongside the other arts. So I think a lot of those people are kind of really kind of foundational. Stan Brakhage, has a lot of hand-painted films. If you have a Criterion subscription, you can see a lot of his hand-painted films. Marie Menken, Bruce Bailey. There's a film called Castro Street that I have a 16mm print of that I've watched over and over and over. The sound editing of Arthur Lipsett. None of these are household names, but like Arthur Lipsett was a major influence on George Lucas somehow. You would not see that in George Lucas's films either, but Lucas continues to fund experimental film because of Lipsett's influence on him. So again, names that are not household names, and then, more contemporary folks who, again, I don't know if it makes sense to rattle off Jem Cohen's name and Alan Berliner and Bill Brown. These are people closer to my generation whose work I saw when I was first making work and who really kind of made me understand, a kind of tribe that I could become part of.
What are you working on now?
Yeah, so I have been working with the techs over in Hopkins Hall in our SADR, the studios for art and design research. The techs have been great. I came in with a crazy idea. I said, this Bolex camera, the 16 millimeter camera, a hand wound, there's no motor, it's run with a spring. You have to wind it every 25 seconds of shooting. I wanted so that it has a 4:3 aspect ratio, so slightly wider than tall rectangle. I wanted to figure out if I could shoot with the camera on its side, but to do that, I realized when I went out and tried to do it, when I put the camera on the ground, I couldn't get my eye to where the viewfinder was. So first we had to figure out if I could turn the viewfinder into like a periscope. So I'm looking down at it while the camera's on the ground because I'm shooting plants in the garden. And it's a sort of, rite of spring type film. And so yes, we did that. And then I realized sometimes I'll need to be shooting on a tripod too. So then we had to make a weird tripod mount. It's basically like a plate that holds the camera on its side. And so when I show this film, I'm going to project it with the projectors on their side. And so it's a little bit of a joke about vertical video. We live in an era of vertical video from our TikTok influencers. My students certainly start out shooting that way. The ergonomics of the phone suggests shooting video vertically. So I'm perversely making a vertical 16 millimeter film that, again, so it's a formal investigation that takes me off the hook a little bit for having a kind of brilliant idea about some sort of essayistic thing. And instead, I just really want to sort of share the joy of being in the community garden in spring and the work I do over there.
Well, say a little bit more about the community garden.
Yeah,
you mentioned it earlier, but...
Yeah. So during the pandemic, from my office window, I could look out and see this slightly derelict community garden that had been around for almost a decade. I knew that the people who had started it had been looking for someone to take it over. We transformed our yard. I terraced the front yard. We ripped out all the grass, put in a bunch of edible stuff and pollinators. And when we finished that, I figured I'd just wander over to the community garden that I could see from my window. There was a vacant lot there that we were cutting across. Now we have to go around the corner, so it's,
And this is in Wineland Park, I believe.
Exactly, yes? Yeah. So it's 4th Street Farms in Wineland Park. It's been around now for 14 years. It's owned by the city, so we rent it from them for $10 a year, and as long as we keep it in good working order, it's really kind of wonderful. It's got kind of a great backbone with all of the permaculture that is there, a lot of mature fruit trees, raspberry bramble. But we've also sort of done a lot of annual stuff with it and really just battling the weeds right now. And keeping out of the poison ivy. There's a little bit of poison ivy. Be careful if you go over there. I don't know.
So the film is going to be about the community garden. How are you framing this?
Yeah, I'm debating, and we'll see. My last film grew out of some activism that neighbors and I did, where a developer was going to bulldoze an entire city lot to make way for new apartments. And we support density. We understand we've got a bunch of new people moving here, but I think there's a smart way to do this that doesn't just wipe out hundreds of years of history. So there were 3 really mature trees in that site, and so we saved 2 of the 3 trees, in fact. We were able to, because they had to ask for a variance, we were able to extract from them a promise to save 2 of the 3 trees. The tree we lost was a 200-year-old sycamore. So I didn't know that was going to be a film, but it turned out it was a film, and I didn't know what the elements of it would be. But we had a ceremony for the sycamore before they took it down, and my friend Laura wrote this really beautiful thing about the 200 years of history that the sycamore had witnessed and what had happened in Wineland Park over those years. And I just had her come down to my house, and, as I thought about the film, there's a sort of abstract part at the start that has a nod to Ferdinand de Saussure and the course in general linguistics, and so that's the title, which is, right, this, the signifier, signified relationship. Anyway, that went deep and could be unpacked, but I won't do that. So I guess what I'm saying is I don't know where this film is going, and it's nice not to know. It was one of the dissatisfactions I had when I was producing scholarship, is that I had to pretend to know. And it's really great for experimental cinema to just say, here's a bunch of stuff I'm thinking about and looking at, and have an experience with me, and, we can have a conversation afterwards. Yeah.
So filmmaking is different from producing scholarship. It really is a different process, aside from the medium. It
just feels a lot more open. I mean, you said openness earlier in a different context, but I do feel like it's really a lot more open. I do feel like it's really a lot more... a PBS documentary is not, right? It feeds you the information. It's often a very satisfying meal, but it tells you where it's going. It goes there and it tells you where it just went. Experimental cinema is not like that, right? It really just says, take this ride with me, figure out what you can make of it. You figure out the rules of the thing because, each one kind of has a different set of rules that govern it. And then again, I really enjoy the conversations after my screening. It's one of the things that I really appreciate about doing these live shows is afterwards really getting to hear what people are responding to and what they're making of it or what questions they still have, What is this all about?
Roger Beebe, thank you.
Thanks for having me.
Voices of Excellence is produced and recorded at the Ohio State University College of Arts and Sciences Marketing and Communications Studio. More information about the podcast and our guests can be found at go.osu.edu/voices. Voices of Excellence is produced by Doug Dangler. I'm Jen Farmer.